Today, we're going to look into 6 most evil serial killer stories. Let's begin with the first one. When a waitress at a small-town Denny's restaurant received an unusual feeling about a man and little girl who walked in at 2 a.m. on July 2, 2005, she immediately knew something was wrong. The child looked familiar, and the man seemed nervous and out of place. Thinking quickly, she grabbed a newspaper with missing children photos and compared it to the girl sitting just a few tables away. What she discovered would end one of the most horrific crime sprees in American history. This story takes us to a quiet lakeside town in Idaho called Coeur d'Alene. It's the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where children play outside without fear, and where violent crime is almost unheard of. But on May 16, 2005, what should have been just another quiet Monday morning quickly became a day that would haunt the nation. It all started when police received a call to check on a family who hadn't been seen or heard from in days. When officers arrived at the house on Frontage Road, they found the front door unlocked. What they discovered inside would shock even the most experienced investigators. The scene was horrific. Inside the house, they found 3 bodies. 40-year-old Brenda Groen, her 13-year-old son Slade, and her boyfriend Mark Mackenzie had all been brutally murdered. Each victim had been tied up with zip ties and beaten to death with a hammer. The violence was so extreme that it was clear this wasn't a simple robbery gone wrong. But this crime scene was just the beginning of a nightmare that would only grow darker. 2 of Brenda's youngest children were missing, 9-year-old Dylan and 8-year-old Shasta. Their beds were empty, and there were no signs of them anywhere in the house. Authorities feared the worst and immediately issued an Amber Alert. Search teams scoured the dense woods and winding roads around the town.
My name is Don Robinson. I am a retired FBI supervisory special agent. Our role in this early stage of the case at the FBI was to find the children.
The FBI stepped in to help with the investigation, but Dylan and Shasta were nowhere to be found. For weeks, the search continued. Police followed every lead, interviewed every possible witness, and checked every tip that came in. The case made national news. Posters with the children's faces were everywhere. Their father, Steve Groen, made tearful pleas on television, begging for his children's safe return. "Please, if you have my children, just bring them home," he said during one press conference. "They're just babies. They don't deserve this." The community rallied around the family. Volunteers helped with search efforts. People hung yellow ribbons on trees and fence posts. Everyone hoped and prayed that somehow, somewhere, Dylan and Shasta were still alive. But as the days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. Most missing children cases are solved within the first 48 hours. After that, the chances of finding them alive dropped significantly. By the time a month had passed, many people feared the worst. While the search for Dylan and Shasta continued, investigators were working hard to identify the person responsible. They carefully examined the crime scene, looking for any clues that might lead them to the killer. What they didn't know was that the man who had destroyed this family was already on the run, and he had the children with him. The person responsible was Joseph Edward Duncan III, a 42-year-old registered offender with a long history of violence against children. Duncan had been born in North Carolina in 1963 and had been committing crimes since he was a teenager. His first known offense happened when he was just 15 years old. In 1978, he attacked a 9-year-old boy. This wasn't just a one-time incident. It was the beginning of a pattern that would continue for decades. Duncan's childhood was troubled. He claimed he was mistreated as a child, though his family disputed this. His parents divorced when he was young, and he moved between different homes and schools. He never graduated from high school and struggled to keep jobs. As an adult, Duncan's crimes became more frequent and more serious. He was arrested multiple times for various violent crimes. He spent years in prison, but each time he was released, he would commit more crimes. In 1980, while in juvenile detention, Duncan told a therapist that he had harmed at least 6 boys. He estimated that by the time he turned 16, he'd harmed as many as 13 younger boys. The warning signs were there, but somehow, Duncan kept slipping through the cracks of the justice system. By 2005, Duncan was living in Minnesota and working odd jobs, but his violent tendencies hadn't gone away. In March of that year, he was arrested for hurting 2 young boys at a playground. This should have been the end of his criminal career. With his long history of violence, he should have been held in jail until his trial. But incredibly, the judge set bail at just $15,000. A local businessman who had befriended Duncan agreed to post the bail money. On April 5, 2005, Duncan walked out of jail a free man. He was supposed to stay in Minnesota and report to authorities regularly while awaiting trial. Instead, Duncan disappeared. He violated his bail conditions and became a fugitive. A warrant was issued for his arrest, but by then, it was too late. Duncan had already begun planning his next crime. He'd been driving around the Pacific Northwest, looking for potential victims. When he saw the growing family's home by the lake, he decided they would be his targets. On the night of May 15, 2005, Duncan put his plan into action. He had been watching the family for days, learning their routines and waiting for the right moment to strike. According to Shasta's later testimony, she and Dylan were sleeping in their bedroom when their mother came rushing in. Brenda woke them up and whispered urgently, "Someone is in the house." The children followed their mother into the living room, where they saw Duncan for the first time. He was wearing dark clothes and black gloves, and he was holding a weapon. He didn't look wild or angry. He looked calm and in control, like he had planned this all along. Duncan used zip ties to bind the hands of Brenda, her boyfriend Mark, and 13-year-old Slade. Then he forced little Shasta and Dylan to sit outside on the front lawn while he went back into the house. From outside, the children could hear horrible sounds coming from inside. Loud thuds and crashes that told them something terrible was happening. Then Slade, bloody and badly hurt, stumbled out the front door as if trying to escape. But Duncan caught him and dragged him back inside. Duncan violently ended the lives of all 3 victims with a hammer. The violence was so extreme that it was clear he felt no mercy or remorse. When he was finished, he put Shasta and Dylan in a stolen red Jeep Cherokee and drove away into the night. What happened next was a 6-week nightmare that no child should ever have to endure. Duncan drove the children to remote campsites in the wilderness, far from any help or chance of escape. During this time, Duncan repeatedly hurt and mistreated both children. He made no attempt to hide what he had done to their family. In fact, he bragged about it. He told Shasta coldly that he had beaten her mother, brother, and Mark to death with a hammer. The children lived in constant fear, never knowing what Duncan might do next. They were completely at the mercy of a man who had already proven he was capable of unspeakable violence. The worst moment came several weeks into their captivity. According to Shasta's testimony, Duncan claimed that his weapon went off accidentally while he was looking for beer in his vehicle. Dylan was hit in the stomach and fell to the ground, screaming and begging for help. But what happened next wasn't an accident at all. As Dylan lay on the ground, wounded and terrified, Duncan picked up the weapon and pointed it at the boy's head. He pulled the trigger, but the weapon jammed. Dylan, despite his injuries, begged Duncan not to hurt him. Duncan reloaded the weapon and aimed again. This time, it fired. Dylan, just 9 years old, was gone. Shasta was now completely alone with her family's killer. She had watched him take the lives of her mother, her brother Slade, Mark, and now Dylan. She was the only one left. A few days later, Duncan gave Shasta a horrifying choice.
He was like, how do you want to die? And he was like, just like, you have the choice to be strangled or you have the choice to be shot like your brother, and that one's gonna be quicker. Like, you won't feel pain.
He asked her if she wanted to die, and if so, how? By strangulation or by weapon? Shasta, thinking quickly, chose strangulation, hoping it might give her more time to figure out how to escape. Duncan wrapped a rope around her neck and began to pull. But just as she was losing consciousness, Shasta managed to gasp out Jet, a nickname she had started calling him during their captivity. For some reason, that one word made him stop. He loosened the rope and asked her an unexpected question. "Do you want to meet my mom?" Shasta, desperate to survive, said yes. This decision would save her life. Duncan's decision to take Shasta to meet his mother led them back to civilization. They drove back to Coeur d'Alene, where Duncan's mother lived. But first, they stopped at a Denny's restaurant for breakfast. It was about 2 a.m. on July 2nd, 2005, when Duncan and Shasta walked into the restaurant. To most people, they just looked like a tired man and a sleepy child. But one waitress took a closer look. The waitress had been following the story of the missing children in the news. She had seen the posters and the television reports. When she looked at the little girl sitting with the disheveled man, something clicked. Moving quickly but quietly, she grabbed a newspaper that had photos of the missing children. She compared the pictures to the girl in the restaurant. It was definitely her. This was Shasta Grown. The waitress discreetly told her manager, who immediately called the police.
Can you describe the male to me? I'd say 6'3". Okay. Really slim. Okay. Dark hair? Yeah, curly. Curly. All right, we'll have someone send it that way.
Other customers who had also recognized Shasta positioned themselves near the exits to make sure Duncan couldn't escape. Within minutes, police arrived at the restaurant. They arrested Duncan without incident. He didn't resist or try to run. He just sat there as officers handcuffed him and read him his rights. Shasta was immediately taken to the hospital for medical treatment. She was thin and pale, but incredibly, she was alive. After 47 days of unimaginable horror, she was finally safe. Duncan's arrest triggered a massive investigation. The FBI worked with local police to piece together everything that had happened during those 6 weeks. They searched the campsites where Duncan had held the children. They recovered evidence and tried to locate Dylan's body. Shasta, despite everything she had been through, was incredibly brave. She told investigators exactly what had happened, helping them understand the full scope of Duncan's crimes. Her testimony would be crucial in ensuring that Duncan faced justice for what he had done. The investigation also revealed that Duncan's crimes weren't limited to the Groen family. As police dug deeper into his background, they found connections to other unsolved cases across the country. Duncan's criminal history painted a picture of a man who had been dangerous for decades. Each time he was released from prison, he would disappear into society, only to strike again months or years later. In 1997, 10-year-old Anthony Martinez had been kidnapped and killed in California. For years, the case had been unsolved. But when investigators compared fingerprints from that crime scene to Duncan's, they found a match. Duncan eventually confessed to killing Anthony, saying it was his revenge against society. There were other cases too. Duncan admitted to killing two sisters in Seattle in 1996, Samijo White and Carmen Cubius. The girls, ages 11 and 9, had been walking home from school when they disappeared. Their bodies had been found nearly 2 years later, but until Duncan's confession, no one knew who was responsible. Duncan's own writings, found in his personal belongings, revealed the mind of a predator. He had kept detailed journals describing his thoughts about harming children. These writings showed that his crimes were not impulsive acts, but carefully planned attacks. Duncan faced multiple trials in different states for his various crimes. The legal process was complex and took several years to complete. In Idaho, he was charged with 3 counts of first-degree taking of life for ending the lives of Brenda, Slade, and Mark, plus kidnapping charges. Initially, Duncan planned to fight the charges, but eventually, he pleaded guilty to avoid putting Shasta through the trauma of testifying in court. The federal government also charged Duncan with crimes related to Dylan's death and the mistreatment of both children. These charges carried the possibility of the death penalty. In a surprising move, Duncan fired his lawyers and decided to represent himself during the penalty phase of his federal trial. After a psychiatric evaluation confirmed he was mentally competent, the court allowed him to proceed. The jury deliberated for just 3 hours before returning their verdict: death. Duncan was sentenced to die for his crimes against the growing family. Duncan spent his remaining years on federal death row in Indiana. He filed no appeals and seemed to accept his fate. In 2020, he was diagnosed with an aggressive form of brain cancer. He refused treatment and died in his prison cell on March 28, 2021, at the age of 58. The Grown family tragedy had a lasting impact on the community and on laws designed to protect children. Many people questioned how someone with Duncan's violent history had been allowed to post bail and disappear. The case led to discussions about bail reform and better monitoring of registered offenders. It also highlighted the importance of the Amber Alert system, which had helped keep Shasta's case in the public eye. For Shasta, the road to recovery was long and difficult. She had survived something that no child should ever have to endure. But she showed incredible strength and resilience as she worked to rebuild her life. Steve Grown, who had lost 3 of his children and his ex-wife, became an advocate for victims' rights. He spoke publicly about the need for better protection of children and tougher sentences for repeat offenders. The case also had an impact on law enforcement training. The way the Denny's staff and customers handled the situation, recognizing Shasta, alerting authorities, and preventing Duncan's escape, became a model for how civilians should respond in similar situations. The Amber Alert system also received renewed attention after Shasta's rescue. The system had kept Shasta's case in the public eye for weeks. Without those constant reminders, the Denny's waitress might not have recognized her. Child safety advocates used the case to push for better protection laws. They argued that people with Duncan's history should never be allowed to post bail. The case also highlighted the need for better mental health services in the prison system. The Joseph Duncan case remains one of the most disturbing crimes in modern American history. It shows how a single person's evil actions can destroy multiple families and traumatize an entire community. But it also shows the power of human resilience and the importance of never giving up hope. Shasta Grown's survival and recovery demonstrate that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can endure. The case raises important questions about our justice system and how we protect society's most vulnerable members. How many more dangerous people like Duncan are out there, slipping through the cracks, waiting for their chance to strike. Duncan had been flagged as a high-risk offender multiple times throughout his criminal career, yet somehow he had been allowed to post bail and disappear. The system that was supposed to protect society had failed. Legal experts began calling for reforms to the bail system. They argued that violent offenders with extensive criminal histories should be held without bail. The case also sparked debates about the death penalty and whether some individuals are simply too dangerous to ever be released. Throughout all of these debates, Steve Groan became a tireless advocate for victims' rights. He argued that his children's deaths could have been prevented if the warning signs had been taken seriously. Duncan's death in prison brought some closure to the case, but it couldn't undo the damage he had caused. The Groan family will never be whole again. Dylan will never grow up. But Shasta's survival ensures that her family's story will be remembered, and that their deaths weren't in vain. In the years following the tragedy, memorials were established to honor the victims. The community of Coeur d'Alene changed after the tragedy. People became more aware of the dangers that existed in their seemingly safe town, but they also showed their strength by supporting each other. The Denny's restaurant where Shasta was found has become an unlikely landmark. Staff members who were there that night are still recognized as heroes. For many people, the Groan case represents a turning point in how society thinks about violent crime and child safety. As we close this chapter on one of the darkest crimes in recent memory, we're reminded that evil exists in this world. But we're also reminded that good people, like the Denny's waitress who recognized Shasta, the customers who blocked the exits, and the investigators who worked tirelessly to solve the case, can make a difference. The fight between good and evil continues every day, and sometimes, thankfully, good wins. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you think the justice system failed by allowing Duncan to post bail? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and thank you for listening. Let's move on to the second serial killer story. When 16-year-old Cheryl Ferguson walked into Conroe High School that Saturday morning, she had no idea she would never walk out alive. What happened next would shock a small Texas town and expose a justice system so broken that an innocent man would spend 10 years on death row.
In September 1980, as Clarence Brantley sat in jail charged with the rape and murder of 16-year-old Cheryl Ferguson,
while the real killers walked free. This is not just a story about murder. This is a story about how racism, corruption, and lies can destroy lives. It's about how the truth can be buried for years, and how justice can fail so completely that it becomes injustice itself. Cheryl Ferguson was excited as she rushed around her house that Saturday morning. At just 16 years old, she had been chosen as the manager for her high school volleyball team. Today was special. It was her first day in this new role, and the team was traveling over an hour away for an important scrimmage. The blonde teenager from Belleville High School grabbed her things and hurried to catch the team bus. They were headed to Conroe High School, located just north of Houston, Texas. It had only been 2 weeks since her birthday, and Cheryl was looking forward to starting her junior year when school began in August. The bus ride was filled with chatter and excitement. The girls were pumped up for their game, and Cheryl felt proud to be part of something bigger than herself. She had no way of knowing that this ordinary Saturday would become the last day of her life. When the Belleville team arrived at Conroe High School, everything seemed normal. The building was quiet since it was a weekend, but several maintenance workers were around finishing up projects before the new school year started. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, Cheryl stepped off the bus and dropped her belongings in the gymnasium. The game was about to begin, but first, she needed to use the bathroom. She asked some janitors in the hallway for directions, and they pointed her toward the nearest restroom. As Cheryl walked up the stairs to the landing where the bathroom was located, one of the janitors began talking to her and showing her the way. She seemed like any normal teenager, polite, hurried, and focused on getting back to her team. But as she reached the bathroom door, something terrible happened. Cheryl felt a strong hand grab her arm tightly. In that moment, her world changed forever. By 9:30, Cheryl's coach was getting worried. The game was supposed to start, but their team manager had not returned from the bathroom. This was not like Cheryl at all. She was responsible and always where she was supposed to be. Several girls from the team walked around the school looking for her. They checked the bathroom, the hallways, and even outside the building, but there was no sign of Cheryl anywhere. The coach tried to stay calm, but a feeling of dread was growing in her stomach. The volleyball game continued for an hour, but everyone was distracted. Where could Cheryl have gone? She would never just leave without telling anyone. Something was very wrong. By 11 o'clock in the morning, the coach had organized a full search of the school. Parents, school employees, and even some local police officers joined in. They called out Cheryl's name through every hallway and checked every room they could access. But still, there was no trace of the missing teenager. While everyone was searching for Cheryl, 5 janitors had been working throughout the morning at Conroe High School. Clarence Brandley was the supervisor, a 29-year-old black man who took his job seriously. He was working with 4 other men that Saturday to get the school ready for the new year. Clarence had not even known there was a volleyball game happening that day. At 9:15, he went into the gym to open windows and doors so it would not get too hot for the players. Meanwhile, Henry Peace was polishing the floor in the teacher's lounge. 3 other janitors, John Sessom, Gary Ackerman, and Sam Martinez, were in the cafeteria setting up tables and chairs. It seemed like a normal work day for all of them. Around 9:45, Clarence walked past the cafeteria carrying an armload of toilet paper. He told the 3 men to head over to the vocational building, and he would come unlock it in just a minute. As he started up the stairs, Gary called out that there was a girl in the bathroom. Clarence told him it was no problem since he was going to the boys' bathroom anyway. After dropping off the toilet paper, he went to his office for a quick break and a cigarette while listening to the radio. Clarence was trying to keep his crew busy until lunch so they could earn a full day's pay. The search for Cheryl continued for hours. Police officers, parents, and school staff looked everywhere they could think of. The volleyball team was devastated. Their friend had simply vanished. Clarence and Henry Peace decided to help with the search. They had finished their work and wanted to do whatever they could to find the missing girl. Together, they began checking areas of the school that others might have missed. That's when they decided to look in the auditorium loft, a storage area above the stage where theater props were kept. It was not a place most people would think to check, but they wanted to be thorough. Clarence opened the door to the loft and looked around. At first, everything seemed normal. But then he noticed something behind a piece of plywood that made his blood run cold. There, hidden from view, was Cheryl Ferguson's body. She was completely naked except for one sock, and she was not breathing. The sight was so shocking that Clarence could barely process what he was seeing. He immediately called for the police and then sat down in the auditorium, stunned. Somehow, a terrible crime had happened just feet away from where they had been working, and they had no idea. When the police arrived, they quickly secured the scene. An autopsy would later reveal that Cheryl had been both raped and strangled. The brutality of the crime shocked everyone involved in the investigation. Henry Peace and Clarence Brandley were taken to the police station to give statements about their day. They answered every question honestly and even provided blood samples to help with the investigation. Both men also agreed to take lie detector tests, which they passed. Clarence understood that finding the body made him a suspect, but he was not worried. He knew he was innocent, and he believed the truth would come out quickly. He wanted nothing more than for Cheryl's real killer to be caught. But what Clarence did not know was that some people had already decided he was guilty. As the only black man among the 5 janitors, he became the primary focus of the investigation almost immediately. The racist attitudes of some investigators would soon become clear. Just a few days after the murder, Clarence Brandley was arrested. He was completely shocked. This had to be a terrible mistake. He was innocent, and once the real investigation was complete, surely they would realize their error and release him. But that's not what happened. Instead of looking for the real killers, investigators focused all their attention on building a case against Clarence. Evidence that might have pointed to other suspects was ignored or lost. The racism in the investigation was obvious and sickening. Despite having no real evidence against him, Clarence was convicted and sentenced to death. An innocent man was now sitting on death row for a crime he did not commit. While Clarence Brandley was fighting for his life in prison, the real story of what happened to Cheryl Ferguson was slowly coming to light. It would take years, but eventually the truth could not stay hidden. Gary Ackerman had been nervous about working that Saturday, but he needed the overtime money. His girlfriend was pregnant, and every dollar counted. He was not particularly close with the other janitors, but he was friendly with James Robinson, who had recently quit his job at the school. James had been hanging around the school that day, even though he no longer worked there. He and Gary had gotten into trouble together before, and Gary knew that James brought out the worst in him. But he was not smart enough to stay away from his bad influence. That morning, Gary had just finished unstacking chairs in the cafeteria when he saw a blonde teenager walking toward them. Cheryl asked where the nearest bathroom was located, so Gary jumped up to show her the way. As they walked up the staircase together, Gary tried to make conversation, but Cheryl seemed focused on getting to the bathroom and back to her team. Gary felt an urge growing inside him, something dark and dangerous that he should have fought against. Suddenly, James Robinson appeared, jogging up the stairs to join them. When Cheryl reached the bathroom door, James grabbed her arm and pushed her inside. Her screams filled the hallway. What happened next in that bathroom was unspeakable. Cheryl pleaded and screamed for the men to let her go. Her cries were loud enough that John Sessom could hear them from the cafeteria below. He saw the men on the stairway with her, but could not believe something terrible was actually happening. Instead of helping, John turned back to his work and hoped everything would be fine. This decision would haunt him for years to come. For 20 minutes, Gary Ackerman and James Robinson committed horrible crimes against an innocent 16-year-old girl. When it was over, Cheryl Ferguson was dead. Gary left the bathroom acting calm. He joined John and Sam in the cafeteria, but inside he was panicking. He knew what he had just done was terrible. At 9:45, Clarence came down the hall with toilet paper. Gary quickly called out, "There's a girl in there." Clarence said it was fine since he was going to the boys' bathroom. Gary went with the others to the vocational building. He was anxious, worried that Clarence might find Cheryl's body. When Clarence unlocked the building, Gary made an excuse about getting a Coke and went back to check the bathroom. It was empty. Outside, he saw James at the dumpster throwing away a bag with Cheryl's clothes. They talked quickly, then James left. Gary returned to the others, keeping his horrible secret. When work ended at 11 o'clock, Gary rode home with John Sessom. During the ride, Gary threatened John to forget what he had seen. He told John they had been working together all morning and that was their story. At home, Gary was upset. His girlfriend noticed something was wrong. He told her and her father that Cheryl's clothes were in the school dumpster. This proved Gary knew details only the killer would know. Police wouldn't find the clothes for days. On Monday, all the janitors gave statements. They said they saw a girl go to the bathroom and Clarence went upstairs with toilet paper. They didn't mention the screams or violence. John stayed quiet because of Gary's threats. This silence helped send an innocent man to death row. While Gary and James went free, Clarence faced a nightmare of legal battles. He endured trials, a mistrial, and a false conviction that put him on death row. For years, he came within days of execution while lawyers fought to prove he was innocent. Police got tips right away, including information from Gary's girlfriend's father, but they ignored anything that didn't support their case against Clarence. They had decided he was guilty and made the evidence fit. The racism was obvious. Clarence was treated differently from day one because he was black. The white janitors who actually committed the crime were barely investigated. After years of fighting, Clarence got a break. James Robinson's ex-girlfriend, Brenda, came forward with shocking news. Brenda was 16 and pregnant when James confessed to her after the murder. He came home that day and said he had killed a girl at the school. Then he packed up and left town, abandoning her. At first, Brenda thought James was making excuses for leaving. But 6 years later, when she heard about Clarence's case on the news, she realized James was telling the truth. Her decision to speak up led to a new investigation. Private investigators found that Gary's family had tried to give information about his involvement 5 years earlier, but police had ignored them. When Gary was questioned again, the truth poured out.
What did you hear from her?
She was just hollering no.
Did you see what it was that James was doing to her, which made her holler no?
Well, he grabbed her.
John Sessom also finally told the truth.
He went up and was talking to her. And I just had in my mind that something going wrong.
He had stayed silent for years because of Gary's threats, but couldn't live with the guilt anymore. James was questioned again, too. When he took a lie detector test, it showed he was lying every time he claimed to be innocent. After failing repeatedly, James said something chilling. "I don't know. I'm just not sure. I could have done it and forgot. I don't remember." With all these confessions and new evidence, it was clear Clarence had been telling the truth all along. He was completely innocent. In 1987, Clarence got a new trial. After more legal battles, charges were dropped in 1990. He walked out of prison a free man, but had lost 10 years of his life. He was robbed of time with his 5 children, his career, and his reputation. The worst part is what happened to the real killers. Despite all the confessions and evidence, Gary and James were never charged with any crime. By the time the truth came out, most physical evidence was destroyed or lost. Nothing was left for DNA testing. The only blood evidence showed the killer had type A blood, which matched Gary and James, but not Clarence. After Clarence's release, the district attorney shocked everyone. Despite having confessions, witnesses, and clear proof of Clarence's innocence, the DA decided not to charge Gary or James. The official reason was lack of evidence, but everyone knew the truth. The system that was eager to convict an innocent black man was suddenly reluctant to prosecute the white men who actually committed the crime. Cheryl's family was devastated. They had lost their daughter horribly, and her killers would never face justice. The system failed them completely. Gary and James got away with rape and murder. They destroyed a young girl's life, ruined an innocent man's life, and traumatized a community. They faced no consequences. The case became famous worldwide as an example of how badly justice can fail. It showed how racism can blind investigators and how innocent people can be destroyed by a system meant to protect them. Clarence tried to rebuild his life after release, but the damage was done. He lost everything: his job, reputation, years with family, and faith in the system. He tried to sue for compensation, but was largely unsuccessful. In 2018, Clarence died, still fighting for recognition and compensation. His family continues seeking justice for the years he lost. Meanwhile, Gary and James lived as free men. They watched their children grow up and enjoyed freedoms they had stolen from both Cheryl and Clarence. One disturbing aspect is how many people knew the truth but stayed silent. John heard Cheryl's screams but turned away instead of helping. Gary's girlfriend and her father knew he was involved but took years to speak up. James's ex-girlfriend knew he was a killer but didn't come forward until an innocent man nearly faced execution. Each person had the power to prevent injustice, but fear, threats, and indifference kept them quiet. Their silence let an innocent man suffer while killers walked free. The Clarence Brandley case shows every way a justice system can fail. From the start, investigators decided guilt based on race, not evidence. They ignored witnesses, lost evidence, and focused only on building a case against who they'd already decided was responsible. Courts failed by allowing illegal procedures. Appeals failed by taking years to address obvious problems. The DA's office failed by refusing to prosecute real killers, even with overwhelming evidence. Gary and James escaped justice because of their skin color and system corruption. They manipulated witnesses, destroyed evidence, and lied to protect themselves. Gary threatened John into silence, willing to let an innocent man die to save himself. James confessed to his girlfriend, then acted suspicious during questioning. But the system that quickly convicted Clarence wouldn't pursue the real killer. Both men knew the racist system would protect them while destroying Clarence. They were right. Cheryl's family lived with unimaginable pain. They lost their daughter violently, then watched the system fail her repeatedly. First, they believed justice was served when Clarence was convicted. But when truth emerged, they realized their daughter's real killers walked free. For Cheryl's parents, the pain was doubled. They lost their child and unknowingly supported convicting an innocent man. Learning the truth, they had to live knowing the system failed everyone. Today, Gary and James have never faced consequences. They took away a girl's future, destroyed an innocent man's life, and traumatized a community. Yet they live as free men. Clarence spent his final years trying to clear his name completely. He died in 2018, still fighting for recognition of the injustice he suffered. The case remains a powerful reminder of what happens when prejudice and corruption control our legal system. Subscribe to our channel to watch more real true crime incidents so you could get awareness. Comment about this incident and pray for Cheryl Ferguson and Clarence Brandley. Let's move on to the third serial killer story. The summer of 1988 in Tokyo started like any other. Children played in parks, families enjoyed festivals, and life moved at its normal pace. But by the end of August, everything had changed. Parents began locking their doors earlier. Children stopped playing outside alone. The reason was simple and terrifying. Someone was hunting the city's youngest residents. What this person did to those innocent victims was so shocking that even veteran detectives who had seen countless crimes found themselves unable to sleep at night. At first, the police believed it might be just one terrible incident, a single tragic disappearance that would be solved quickly. But it soon became clear that something much worse was happening. A dangerous person was hunting in their city, someone who carried a camera everywhere, someone who recorded everything they did. This person was Tsutomu Miyazaki. He was not the kind of man who stood out in a crowd. He stayed in the shadows, away from people's attention. He was pale and thin, with hands that looked different because of a condition he was born with. He rarely looked people in the eyes and almost never spoke to anyone. But when he was alone, behind locked doors, he was creating a twisted world where he had complete control. A world where his victims could never fight back or tell anyone what happened to them. To understand how he became this way, we need to go back to 1962. Tsutomu was born into a wealthy family. His father owned a successful printing business in Itabashi. The family had money and respect in their community. But physically, Tsutomu was different from other children. His hands could not move the way normal hands do. He could not bend his wrist properly, which made simple tasks difficult. Other children at school noticed his strange hands and made fun of him constantly. They called him names and pushed him around. To escape from this cruel treatment, he spent most of his time alone, reading manga comics, watching anime cartoons, and viewing horror movies. In these stories, the monsters were always powerful, and the weak characters always suffered. His family life did not help him feel better about himself. His father was cold and seemed embarrassed to have a son who looked different. His mother had serious mental health problems and could not take care of him properly. His sisters stayed away from him and treated him like he was invisible. The only person in his family who showed him any love was his grandfather. When his grandfather died, Tsutomu fell apart completely. On the day of the funeral, people say he went to the room where his grandfather's ashes were kept. He took some of the ashes and ate them. He believed this would keep part of his grandfather alive inside his own body. This is not how normal people deal with sadness and loss. By 1988, Tsutomu had become someone who never left his room. He lived in a small, dirty space filled with garbage. The walls were covered with shelves, and those shelves were packed with thousands of videotapes. He had horror films, anime shows, and illegal videos. Some of these tapes were things he had made himself. That summer, something inside his mind finally broke completely. On August 22nd, 1988, a 4-year-old girl named Mari Kono was walking alone to visit a friend. She never arrived at her destination. Miyazaki saw her playing near a river and offered to drive her to her friend's house. She was just a little child and thought he was trying to help her, so she got into his car. No one ever saw her alive again. He drove her to a quiet forest area outside Tokyo where no one would find them. There, he killed her with his bare hands by squeezing her neck until she could not breathe anymore. But he did not leave right away. He stayed with her body and took photographs. Then he left her in the forest and came back later with more camera equipment and a knife. He cut off parts of her body and took them home with him. He put her hands in a plastic bag and kept them in his closet like they were special objects. He collected her blood in bottles and drank it over several days. Weeks later, he returned to the forest and gathered some of her bones. He burned these bones himself and then put them in a box. He mailed this box to Mari's family, along with her teeth and school uniform. Inside the package, he included a strange letter with random words that did not make sense together. The words said things like, Mari, cold, cough, throat, rest, death. Mari's family thought someone was playing a sick joke on them. But when police tested the bones, they discovered they were real parts of their daughter. On October 3rd, he found his second victim. This time it was 7-year-old Masami Yoshizawa. He used the same trick to get her into his car by telling her lies about helping her. After he killed her, he left her body in the hills outside the city. But before he left, he took many photographs of her body. This became part of his ritual. He later told police that he enjoyed looking at these pictures while watching horror movies. He would imagine that the victims were talking to him from the photographs. By this time, Miyazaki's crimes had become about more than just having power over someone. He had developed an obsession with dead bodies and cutting them apart. What he did to these children was so terrible that investigators decided not to tell newspapers about all the details. They were afraid that if people knew everything, it would cause panic and might give other dangerous people ideas. In December 1988, he tricked 4-year-old Erika Namba into getting into his car, using the same lies he had used before. After he killed her, he wrapped her body in a blanket and left it on a stranger's front porch like it was some kind of gift. Then he called her family on the telephone without telling them who he was. He told her parents exactly where they could find their daughter. They thought it was someone making a cruel joke until they opened their front door and saw the blanket. He had taken photographs of this too, just like everything else he did. Then, in June 1989, he found his final victim. Her name was Ayako Nomoto, and she was only 5 years old. This time, he convinced her to get into his car while it was parked in a remote area where no one could see them. After he killed her, he did something even more horrible than before. He took her body to his home, where he spent the next 2 days making videos of her dead body. He cut her apart and stored pieces of her in his refrigerator like they were food. Later, he burned most of her remains and threw the ashes in the mountains. But he kept her hands, just like he had done with his first victim. Just 1 month later, in July 1989, police finally caught him. He was trying to take inappropriate photographs of 2 other young girls in a park when their father saw what he was doing and called for help. When police arrested him, they had no idea who they had caught or what he had been doing. But when they searched his home, they realized they had walked into a place that was like a museum of death and suffering. They found thousands of videotapes and dozens of recordings he had made himself. There were photographs of all his victims, drawings he had made, pieces of clothing, bones, and other body parts. In one plastic bag, they found Ayako's hands, which had been partially preserved like they were ancient artifacts. He had put them in a special box and built a small shrine around it, like he was worshipping them. The case shocked everyone in Japan, not just because of what he had done, but because of how calm and emotionless he seemed about it. When police questioned him, Miyazaki said that everything was the fault of a second personality that lived inside his mind. He called this other personality Ratman. He claimed that Ratman had forced him to commit these crimes. He also said he saw things that were not really there. One doctor who examined him said he had multiple personality disorder. Another doctor believed he had schizophrenia, a serious mental illness. But the courts did not believe these explanations. They decided that he was mentally capable of understanding right from wrong, which meant he was legally responsible for his crimes. They said he was not mentally ill, just deeply evil. His trial began in 1990 and lasted almost 7 years. During all that time, Miyazaki barely spoke in court. He never said he was sorry for what he had done. When people confronted him with evidence of his crimes, he seemed confused about why everyone was so upset. He told investigators that he believed he was actually helping the girls by preserving their innocence. In his twisted mind, he thought they were still alive in the videotapes he had made. In 1997, the court sentenced him to death. 11 years later, on June 17, 2008, Tsutomu Miyazaki was executed by hanging in Tokyo. He was not just a killer. He was someone who documented death like it was entertainment. He collected suffering like other people collect stamps. He looked like an ordinary man, but he had turned real life into his own personal horror movie. It was almost 2 o'clock in the morning on a hot, humid August night in 1982. A young man who worked at a photo development shop in Hong Kong's crowded Mong Kok district was getting ready to finish his shift. He opened a plain envelope that had been dropped off earlier, expecting to see vacation pictures or wedding photos like he processed every day. Instead, under the bright light of his work lamp, he saw something that would give him nightmares for the rest of his life. The film strip showed a woman's body, but she was not alive, and she was not whole. Someone had carefully cut her apart and arranged the pieces like they were creating some kind of sick artwork for their own private collection. The technician's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the telephone when he called the police. By the time the sun came up, Hong Kong police were racing through the neon-lit streets toward the address written on the film envelope. The name on the envelope belonged to Lam Kor Wan, a taxi driver whose neighbors all said the same thing about him. He was polite, quiet, and so ordinary that you would forget you had ever met him. Nobody knew that inside a tiny apartment high above the busy streets was a hidden room where nightmares came to life. Nobody knew that a man who seemed completely normal was hunting the city's daughters while everyone else was sleeping. Lam Kor Wan was born in 1955 to a working-class family that struggled to make ends meet. His father was a mechanic who believed that children should be controlled through fear and punishment. Lam was the oldest son, but being the firstborn did not bring him any special treatment or affection. From the time he was very small, he learned to obey his father through beatings and humiliation. Neighbors remembered him as the boy who never spoke up for himself. He would stand behind his father like a shadow whenever the older man was yelling at shopkeepers or scolding his other children in public. At school, he stayed on the edges of every classroom and every playground. Teachers would mark his name on the attendance sheet, but they rarely noticed whether he was actually there or not. He managed to get average grades, but he never made any real friends. When he did speak, which was not often, his words sounded strange and rehearsed, like he had practiced them in a mirror, rather than just saying what he was thinking. There was no sign yet of the darkness that was growing inside his mind, hidden behind his blank expression. In 1973, desperate to become someone other than the invisible son who disappointed his father, Lam joined the Royal Hong Kong Police Force. For a brief moment, wearing the uniform gave him a taste of what it felt like to have respect and power. But this feeling did not last long. Just a few months later, he was quietly removed from the police force. The official reason given was misconduct, but people whispered about other things. They said he had suffered some kind of mental breakdown they said he had shown interest in things that a young police officer should never have been curious about. Whatever the real truth was, Lam had lost the only position of authority he had ever managed to obtain. After that, he moved from job to job without ever finding anything that satisfied him. He tried working in factories and doing odd jobs for people, but nothing seemed to fit. Finally, he got a license to drive a taxi. This gave him permission to drive all night through a city that never slept. It also gave him the perfect opportunity to watch people, learn their habits, and slip through the cracks of society without being noticed. During the day, he was the polite cab driver behind the steering wheel, nodding at customers in his rearview mirror and making small talk about the weather. But at night, when he was alone in his cramped apartment, he would sit staring at anatomy books and medical diagrams. Later, he started looking at photographs that he had secretly taken of passengers who had fallen asleep in his cab, and women he had followed on the street. He began bringing home tools, knives, glass jars, and camera equipment. He learned how to develop film in a makeshift darkroom he built in his bathroom. He made detailed plans and practiced different techniques. In the summer of 1981, those plans finally turned into action. Lam began hunting for victims like a fisherman, casting lines into dark water. Late at night, he would cruise the streets looking for women who were alone and vulnerable. He targeted shop workers who were finishing late shifts, students heading home from night classes, and hostesses who were done with another evening working in neon-lit bars. Sometimes he would offer them a cheap ride home when other taxis were hard to find. Sometimes he would promise them extra money if they would pose for some photographs. He always looked so ordinary and harmless. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and spoke in a soft voice. He had a small smile that made him seem like someone who could never hurt anyone. When they got into his taxi, the bright lights of the city would blur into streaks of color as he drove. Lam would take them through quiet streets, making sure no one was following or watching. Then he would drive to his apartment building, usually with some excuse about needing to stop for a moment. Maybe he would say he needed to get money from his room, or he needed to pick up his camera equipment. He would invite them to come inside and wait. They rarely said no because he seemed so safe and trustworthy. Once they were inside his apartment, the door would lock behind them. The windows were already covered with thick black curtains that blocked out all the light from the street. In that silence, with the city's noise completely cut off, Lam's polite mask would disappear. He would kill them quickly and methodically, always being careful not to make noise that might alert the neighbors. He was always careful not to leave evidence that someone might find. But death was never the end for Lam's victims. After they were gone, he would carry their bodies to a corner of his bedroom where he had set up a workbench under harsh fluorescent lights. There, he would turn his tiny room into his own private morgue. He would pose the bodies in different positions and take photographs from every possible angle. He studied them the way a scientist studies specimens under a microscope, taking them apart piece by piece. Some parts he would preserve in glass jars, sealing them carefully and writing labels like they were rare scientific samples. But he always kept souvenirs too. Purses, scarves, earrings, and other small personal items that still smelled faintly of perfume. These were his reminders that these women had once walked the same streets as everyone else in the city. After each murder, Lam would wash his hands carefully, clean all his tools, and go back to driving his taxi as if nothing had happened. He would pick up drunk businessmen stumbling out of bars, tired workers heading home from late shifts, and young couples who were walking home together. These passengers would sit just inches away from the same seat where a victim had sat just hours before. They never knew what the quiet man behind the steering wheel had done in the darkness. Between 1981 and 1982, 4 young women disappeared into his private world of horror. Their families reported them missing to the police, but the officers assumed they had probably run away from home. Nobody looked twice at the shy taxi driver with thick glasses who seemed so harmless. He was invisible, which was exactly how he wanted it. He might have stayed invisible forever if he had not made one crucial mistake. In August 1982, Lamb brought a roll of film to a photo lab for development. Maybe he had become so confident in his invisibility that he did not think twice about the risk. Maybe he wanted to see his trophies printed on glossy paper, clearer than the dark images he developed at home in his bathroom. Whatever his reason was, that single envelope destroyed everything he had built. When the lab technician saw those images, he did not hesitate for even a second. He immediately called the police and told them what he had found. The police traced the film back to Lamb's taxi license, and from there to his apartment address. When officers knocked on his door, Lamb did not try to run away or hide. He opened the door politely, just like he was greeting another pair of passengers who needed a ride somewhere in the city. When they asked to come inside, he let them in without any resistance. What they found inside was what newspapers would later call a house of horrors. Glass jars lined the shelves like trophies in a trophy case. Photographs were stacked in neat piles, each one carefully labeled and organized by date. There were notebooks filled with names, dates, and detailed descriptions of what he had done. In a locked drawer, they found all the tools he had used to cut his victims apart. Everything was there, organized and preserved like a museum exhibition. Lamb did not try to deny anything when they confronted him with the evidence. He confessed calmly and completely, describing exactly how he had done everything, when he had done it, and why he had kept all the pieces. He spoke about it the same way someone might describe their hobby or their job. Reporters who covered the case could not decide what was more disturbing, the horrific photographs or Lamb's complete lack of emotion when he explained what he had done. The families of the missing women sat in the courtroom in complete silence, listening to details that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Hong Kong had seen brutal crimes before, but nothing like this quiet man who had turned his own bedroom into both a slaughterhouse and a shrine. In 1984, Lam Kor Wan was sentenced to death, though his punishment was later changed to life in prison. He is now 70 years old and continues to serve his life sentence at the maximum security Shek Pik prison on Lantau Island. The case remains one of Hong Kong's most notorious crimes, a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who hide in plain sight, looking like everyone else. Let's move on to the 4th serial killer story. Something terrible was about to happen in the spring of 1982. In a quiet park in Anchorage, Alaska, 4 young friends were setting up camp for what should have been a perfect evening. They had snacks, music, and plans to catch a movie later. The air was warm enough that they had traded their heavy winter coats for light hoodies. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed safe. But someone was already watching them. Someone who had made a decision that would change everything forever. Someone who had already killed before and walked free. Someone the system had failed to stop. What happened next would shock the entire city and force Alaska to change its laws forever. This is a story about 2 different men in 2 different places whose crimes were so brutal that still make people shiver today. But before we get to that night in Alaska, we need to understand how these men slipped through the cracks of justice, how they were free to hunt when they should have been locked away, and how the warning signs were there all along, but nobody was paying attention. The first man nobody really noticed. Maybe that's exactly why he got away with it for so long. His name was Charles, and he grew up in a house where silence was heavy and frightening. His mother suffered from a mental illness that cast shadows over their family home in Michigan. Stories about his childhood were few, but those who remembered him described a boy who never quite connected with the world around him. At 16, he left home and never returned. He drifted across the country, picking up small arrests along the way. Shoplifting here, trespassing there. His criminal record was short but strange. By the early 1970s, he had made his way to Alaska, just another face in a state full of people running from something. Then, in 1973, something inside him broke completely. He met a young man named Robert, a 22-year-old grocery store worker. There was no fight between them, no argument, no reason at all. Charles would later tell police that he simply didn't like the way the young man talked, so he beat Robert to death in a park with a piece of metal he found on the ground. He didn't run. He didn't lie. He turned himself in and told the police everything. But instead of going to prison, Charles was declared not guilty by reason of mental illness. Doctors said he had paranoid mental problems and sent him to a high-security hospital in California for people who had committed crimes while mentally ill. For 7 years, he stayed in that hospital. Then in 1980, doctors made a decision that would cost 4 young people their lives. They said Charles was better. They said he was no longer hearing voices. They said he wasn't violent anymore. He seemed calm, medicated, and cooperative. So they let him go. Charles was transferred back to Alaska for supervised re-entry into society. That's how the system works when someone is considered no longer dangerous. They try to slowly reintroduce them with oversight. But the oversight didn't last long enough. Charles started working regular jobs. He washed dishes, worked in clothing stores, kept books for small businesses. He even enrolled in college classes. He was quiet. He showed up on time. He didn't cause trouble. And because of strict privacy laws, none of his bosses, co-workers, or classmates ever knew that the man working beside them had beaten someone to death just a few years earlier. But Charles started drinking again. That should have been a huge warning sign. One of the most important conditions of his release was that he stay sober. But nobody noticed. Or if they did, they didn't say anything. And slowly, the thin barrier between Charles and his violent impulses began to dissolve. Then came May 3rd, 1982. Charles later told investigators that someone had stolen his favorite shirt. Nobody knows if this was even true, or just something his troubled mind created. But he became obsessed with it. He wanted revenge. Or as he put it, I wanted to steal something back. That day, he bought a blue bicycle and a gun from a local shop. He wrapped the weapon in cloth, rode the bike into the woods near Russian Jack Springs Park, and buried the gun under a patch of melting snow. He was preparing for something terrible. That evening, as darkness began to fall, Charles returned to the park. That's where he found them. 4 teenagers were camping near a trail. Joseph, 19, was the first to spot him. Charles had crept up near their tent, probably looking for something to steal. When Joseph caught him, Charles pulled out the gun and shot the young man in the back of the head. The second boy, Vern, 18, ran toward the sound of the gunshot. Charles shot him in the face. Then came the 2 girls. 17-year-old Rebecca and 16-year-old Sabrina came to see what was happening. One by one, he turned the gun on them. 4 shots. 4 young lives ended. Charles didn't take anything. He didn't speak to them. He just picked up his empty bullet casings, buried the gun again, and rode off into the darkness on his blue bicycle. 3 days later, hikers found the bodies. They were still in the clearing, partially sunk into the thawing ground. Police arrived to find almost no clues. No wallets were missing. No valuables were taken. There were no signs of a struggle. It seemed like a perfect crime. But then, investigators found something. A blue bicycle abandoned nearby. It was a rare model sold at only one shop in town. Police pulled the sales records and found just one recent purchase under that model: Charles Meach. When they brought him in for questioning, he confessed immediately. Calmly. Coldly. He told them where he had hidden the gun, where he bought the bike, how he approached the teenagers, how each one died. When asked why, he gave no real reason other than, "I had a few drinks and I did all the things I wasn't supposed to do." Charles tried once again to use the mental illness defense, but Alaska had changed its laws just weeks before the murders. Now the burden was on the defense to prove that someone couldn't tell right from wrong. Charles had hidden the weapon. He had buried the evidence. He confessed in perfect detail. The jury didn't believe he was mentally ill during the crime. He was found guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 396 years in prison. At the time, it was the longest sentence ever given in Alaska. The public was outraged when they learned the truth. Charles had been quietly released back into society after killing someone in 1973. Employers were furious. Parents were terrified. Everyone wanted to know how a man who had already murdered someone could be walking around town with no supervision, able to buy a weapon and choose his next victims. Charles died in prison in December 2004. Natural causes. There was no obituary, no family statement, no memorial service. But the story doesn't end there. Hundreds of miles away, in the wooded landscape of East Texas, another man was about to prove that the system's failures weren't limited to Alaska. His name was Jerry, and he was born in 1948 in rural Texas. Unlike Charles, Jerry's childhood didn't include the typical background that people expect from violent criminals. No reported abuse, no severe trauma. But teachers and neighbors remembered him as quiet, tense, and strangely cold. He didn't act out in obvious ways. He didn't pick fights with other children. But when he looked at you, people said it felt like he was trying to figure out how much pain you could handle. By his late teens, Jerry had dropped out of high school and was drifting across Texas doing manual labor, mechanic work, welding, construction, always short-term jobs. People who worked with him would later say the same thing over and over. He gave off a weird energy. Not angry, not threatening, just wrong. In 1972, he was convicted of a brutal attack on a woman. He served 5 years in prison and was released. A year later, he was arrested again for another violent assault. In 1978, it happened again. This time, he was finally given a longer sentence. But despite the clear pattern of violence and the obvious risk he posed, the Texas Parole Board made a decision in 1985 that would cost 3 young people their lives. They released Jerry early. No ankle monitor, no restrictions, just out. He moved to Hawkins, a small wooded town in East Texas where nobody knew his name, nobody knew his record. He worked odd jobs and drove a distinctive 2-tone blue and white truck. On May 4th, 1986, 3 young people drove out to Lake Hawkins for a quiet afternoon by the water. Suzanne was 18 and had just been accepted to college. Gina was 20 and studying psychology. Brian was 19 and known around town for always helping anyone who had car trouble. They were the kind of people who made others smile just by being around. They parked near the trees, turned up the radio, and walked toward the lake. They weren't doing anything dangerous. They weren't involved in any kind of trouble. They were just young and free, enjoying a beautiful spring day. What happened next was pieced together by detectives later through evidence and witness statements. At some point during the afternoon, Jerry approached them, likely with a weapon. He forced them into their car and drove them away from the lake. Witnesses later remembered seeing his distinctive truck parked near the area, watching. The next morning, Suzanne's body was found on Barnwell Mountain. She had been brutally assaulted and strangled. The way her body was positioned indicated that she had been posed after death, showing a level of cruelty that shocked even experienced investigators. 2 days later, the bodies of Gina and Brian were discovered in a ditch off a rural road. Both had been shot in the head at close range. Police quickly began connecting the dots. Witnesses described a man matching Jerry's appearance near the lake. His truck had been seen in the area. When they brought him in for questioning, they found he still had the murder weapon, a revolver. Tests proved it was the same gun used to kill Gina and Brian. Fibers from Suzanne's clothing were found in his vehicle. It was enough evidence to charge him with capital murder. The town thought it was over. They thought they were finally safe. They were wrong. On July 9th, 1986, Jerry did something that sent the entire region into panic. He escaped from jail. He managed to overpower a guard, steal a weapon, and kidnap a 24-year-old female jail employee named Rosalie. He handcuffed her to himself and fled in a stolen car. They disappeared into the thick East Texas woods. For 16 terrifying hours, Rosalie was his prisoner. She would later say that Jerry acted completely calm the entire time, smiling, talking like everything was normal. At one point, he told her something that made her blood run cold. "I've already killed 3 people. 1 more won't matter." Rosalie finally managed to escape when Jerry fell asleep, and she was able to slip out of the handcuffs. The manhunt that followed was massive. Over 1,000 officers from multiple agencies, helicopters, search dogs, roadblocks everywhere. Local residents were told to lock their doors and stay inside. After 2 days of searching, Jerry was found hiding in an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. Surprisingly, he surrendered without a fight. In 1987, Jerry went on trial for Suzanne's murder. The courtroom was packed with angry, grieving community members. Prosecutors presented evidence from all 3 killings, plus his past convictions and his dramatic escape from jail. The jury took less than an hour to sentence him to death. Jerry was sent to Texas's death row, where he spent 12 years in solitary confinement, filing appeal after appeal. He never gave interviews to reporters. He never expressed any remorse for what he had done. He didn't deny his crimes. He just didn't seem to care. On October 14th, 1999, Jerry was executed by lethal injection. But even that wasn't the end of the story. In 2019, 20 years after Jerry's execution, cold case detectives in Portland, Oregon, reopened an old case from 1979. A 20-year-old woman named Anna had been found in her apartment, brutally assaulted and strangled. There had never been any suspects. The case had gone completely cold. But DNA evidence from the crime scene had been preserved. Investigators ran it through new forensic technology that compares crime scene DNA to public ancestry databases. The match was clear and shocking. Jerry Walter McFadden. He had been there, in Oregon, in 1979, 7 years before the Lake Hawkins murders. 7 years before anyone in Texas even knew his name. Authorities now believe there may be many more victims. Women attacked in different states, different years. Jerry moved around constantly in the 1970s and 1980s. There were gaps in his record, times when he simply disappeared for months at a time. In an age before digital records and instant communication, someone like Jerry could vanish with a fake name, a stolen license plate, and a quiet back road. And he knew how to wait. He knew how to watch. He knew how to pick the exact moment when nobody was looking, then strike quickly and fade back into the shadows. Even law enforcement has admitted they may never know the full scope of Jerry's crimes across multiple states and decades. After his final arrest, one of the investigators who worked the case described Jerry in a single word that still haunts those who heard it: empty. You looked in his eyes, the investigator said, and there was just nothing there. Today, Russian Jack Springs Park in Alaska is still open to the public. People walk those trails, camp in those clearings, and enjoy the natural beauty. There's no marker where the 4 teenagers died. Most people who visit have no idea what happened there. Lake Hawkins in East Texas is also still a popular spot for young people. Families still come to swim and fish. The lake is beautiful and peaceful, but some locals remember, and they watch their children a little more carefully. These cases changed laws in both Alaska and Texas. Alaska tightened its rules for releasing people who had been found not guilty by reason of mental illness. Texas reformed its parole system to prevent early release of violent criminals. But the changes came too late for 7 young people who simply wanted to enjoy life. 4 friends in Alaska just wanted to camp under the stars and catch a movie later. 3 friends in Texas just wanted to spend a sunny afternoon by the lake. They were students, workers, dreamers. They helped their neighbors, made their families proud, and had bright futures ahead of them. Joseph, Vern, Rebecca, and Sabrina in Alaska. Suzanne, Gina, and Brian in Texas. They deserve to grow up, fall in love, start careers, have families of their own. Instead, they became victims of a system that failed to protect them from men who should never have been free to hunt again. The most chilling part of both stories isn't the violence itself. It's how easily it could have been prevented. Charles had already killed someone. Jerry had already attacked multiple women. The warning signs were there. The danger was clear. But bureaucracy, legal technicalities, and a system more concerned with rehabilitation than public safety allowed 2 predators to walk free and choose their next victims. 7 families lost children they'll never get back. 7 futures were erased in moments of senseless violence. 7 lights were snuffed out by men whose eyes showed nothing but emptiness where human compassion should have been. And somewhere out there may be other cases that went cold, 'cause nobody connected the dots in time. That's the truly terrifying part of these stories. Not just what these men did, but what they might have done that we'll never know about. The investigators were right about Jerry. When you looked in his eyes, there really was nothing there. And Charles, described by those who knew him as someone who never quite connected with the world around him, proved that some people are simply too dangerous to ever be given a second chance. These cases remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic gestures or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it walks quietly among us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sometimes it looks ordinary, even harmless. Sometimes the greatest monsters are the ones nobody notices until it's too late. Do you want to learn more about criminal behavior and how to stay safe in our society? These tragic stories show us how important it is to recognize warning signs and understand how dangerous people think and act. Share this story and follow our channel so more people can stay aware and protect themselves and their families from harm. Let's move on to the 5th serial killer story. Easter Sunday, 1975. What should have been a joyful holiday turned into a nightmare in Hamilton, Ohio. 11 family members, mothers, fathers, children, all killed in less than 5 minutes. And the most shocking part, the killer was someone they trusted, someone sitting at the same dinner table. Stay with me, because as this story unfolds, you'll see twists that are darker and more chilling than anyone expected. James Urban Ruppert was born on March 29, 1934, into what appeared to be a normal American family. But behind closed doors, his childhood was being destroyed by the very people who should have loved and protected him. His father Leonard was known throughout Hamilton for his violent temper, turning their home into a war zone where fear ruled every day. But even worse was his mother Charity, a woman whose favoritism would plant the seeds of future tragedy. Charity had wanted a daughter, not James. She made no secret of this disappointment, telling her younger son repeatedly that she wished he had never been born. While she showered endless love and support on his older brother Leonard Jr., James grew up feeling like an unwanted burden in his own home. The house was filled with chickens because of Leonard Sr.'s business ventures. James developed severe allergies to the feathers, causing him constant discomfort and breathing problems. When he begged his parents to remove the chickens, they refused. His suffering meant nothing to them. As James grew older, the psychological abuse only intensified. Charity would compare him constantly to his successful older brother, making it clear that Leonard Jr. was everything James would never be. She told him he was worthless, stupid, and a disappointment to the family name. These words carved deep wounds in James's developing mind, wounds that would never properly heal. When James turned 12 in 1947, his father died of tuberculosis. For most children, losing a parent would be devastating, but for James, his father's death seemed to make everything worse. Leonard Jr., now the oldest male in the house, quickly stepped into the role of family tormentor. He took every opportunity to humiliate and harass his younger brother, continuing the cycle of abuse that their father had started. At school, James had no friends to provide comfort or support. He was a loner who struggled academically, not because he lacked intelligence, but because the constant stress and abuse at home made it impossible to focus on learning. The psychological pressure became so overwhelming that at age 16, James made a desperate decision. He took bed sheets from the house and tried to hang himself in his bedroom. The suicide attempt failed, but it marked a turning point in James's life. Something inside him broke that day. He stopped trying to improve his situation and accepted his role as the family failure. After high school, James enrolled in college with hopes of proving himself worthy of his family's love. But after 2 years, the pressure and his own feelings of inadequacy forced him to drop out. Meanwhile, Leonard Jr. graduated with a degree in electrical engineering and landed a prestigious job with General Electric. The contrast between the brothers became more stark with each passing year. Leonard Jr. bought a beautiful house in Fairfield, married a wonderful woman named Alma, and started building the perfect American family. James, meanwhile, remained unemployed for most of his adult life, living in his childhood bedroom and borrowing money from the very people who had spent years telling him he was worthless. But the cruelest blow was yet to come. Leonard Jr. didn't just succeed in career and life, he also stole the one person James had ever truly cared about. Alma had once been James's girlfriend. He had loved her deeply and believed they had a future together. Watching his successful brother marry the woman of his dreams sent James into a spiral of rage, jealousy, and depression that would consume him for decades. As the years passed, James found comfort in only two activities: drinking alcohol to numb his emotional pain and shooting guns. His collection of firearms grew steadily: a .357 Magnum, 2.2 handguns, and a .22 rifle. He became an expert marksman, spending countless hours at shooting ranges around Hamilton. Neighbors who saw him practice thought it was just a harmless hobby. They had no idea he was developing skills that would soon be put to horrific use. By 1975, James was 41 years old and still living with his elderly mother, Charity. The woman who had spent his entire childhood telling him he was worthless was now dependent on him for care and companionship. But instead of appreciating his presence, Charity had grown tired of supporting her unemployed alcoholic son. The final straw came when Charity delivered an ultimatum that would push James over the edge: find a job and start paying rent, or move out of the house. James had lost his life savings in the devastating 1973 to 1974 stock market crash and had no money to pay rent. The threat of eviction terrified him. Where would he go? How would he survive? At 41, with no job skills and no friends, homelessness seemed like his only option. But James was beginning to formulate a different solution to his problems, a solution so dark and twisted that it would shock the world. On March 29, 1975, James's 41st birthday, several witnesses saw him at the Great Miami River in Hamilton. He was shooting at cans with his guns, practicing his aim with deadly precision. That evening, James went to the 19th Hole Cocktail Lounge, a local bar where he often went to drink away his troubles. The next morning was Easter Sunday. Charity called Leonard Jr. and invited his family for Easter dinner. Leonard Jr. arrived with his wife Alma and their 8 children: 17-year-old Leonard III, 16-year-old Michael, 14-year-old Thomas, 13-year-old Carol, 12-year-old Anne, 11-year-old David, 9-year-old Teresa, and 4-year-old John. The children immediately ran outside for an Easter egg hunt, while the adults prepared to spend a relaxing holiday together. James slept late, nursing a hangover from his night of heavy drinking. By the time he woke up at 4 p.m., the entire family had moved inside to continue their celebration. Charity was in the kitchen making sloppy joes while Alma helped with the preparations. The children were playing games and laughing together. Leonard Jr. was relaxing after the big family meal. It seemed like a perfect family gathering. James joined his family briefly, observing the scene with an expression that no one thought to analyze too carefully. Then he excused himself and went upstairs to his bedroom. When he came back down, he was carrying something that made perfect sense, given his well-known hobby: his guns. James told everyone he was going to the shooting range to practice. This seemed completely normal to his family. They all knew about his love of target shooting. But as James reached the front door, Leonard Jr. made a casual comment about James's old Volkswagen car. To most people, it would have been meaningless small talk between brothers. But to James, already on edge about his failures in life, already consumed with decades of resentment, already desperate about his housing situation, those innocent words felt like one final insult from his successful brother. In that moment, James made a decision that would change 11 lives forever. Instead of leaving for the shooting range as he had announced, James turned around and walked back into the house. The time was exactly 6 p.m. Outside, church bells were ringing throughout Hamilton, their joyous sound about to become the perfect cover for the horror that was about to unfold. What happened next would take less than 5 minutes, but would haunt the community of Hamilton forever. James raised his guns and began firing at the people he had shared a home with, shared meals with, shared a lifetime of memories with. The shots came in rapid succession. His first targets were the people in the kitchen, his elderly mother Charity, his successful brother Leonard Jr., his former girlfriend Alma, and 3 of the children who were helping with dinner, David, Teresa, and Carol. James shot them with cold precision. But James wasn't finished. He methodically moved to the living room where the remaining children were playing. Anne, Leonard III, Michael, and little 4-year-old John had no time to run or hide. James shot them all at close range. He showed no mercy to the children, no hesitation about killing his own flesh and blood. In less than 5 minutes, James had fired 44 shots total. 40 of them found their targets. The Easter Sunday celebration had become a massacre that would go down in history as one of America's worst family murders. But here's where the story takes an even more disturbing turn. Instead of panicking, running away, or immediately calling for help, James did something that revealed the true nature of his crime. He sat down in the living room, surrounded by the bodies of his family members, and waited. For 3 full hours, James sat in that house of death, listening to the silence where laughter had been just minutes before. Blood was soaking through the wooden floors and dripping into the basement. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the aroma of the sloppy joes that would never be eaten. During those 3 hours, James considered killing himself. He held his gun to his head multiple times, but each time he decided against it. After 3 hours of sitting with his victims, James finally made a phone call. But he didn't call 911 immediately. First, he did something that would later become crucial evidence against him. He changed his blood-splattered clothes and cleaned himself up. Then, he calmly dialed emergency services. "There's been a shooting," James told the dispatcher in a steady voice, as if he were reporting someone else's crime. When Hamilton police officers arrived at 635 Minor Avenue just minutes later, James met them at the front door. The officers later said they were struck by how calm and normal he appeared. This short, mild-mannered man with thick black-framed glasses didn't fit their image of a mass murderer. But as the officers entered the house, they encountered a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Blood covered the floors in both the kitchen and living room. Bodies were scattered throughout both rooms, adults and children alike, all victims of the same methodical killer. There was almost no sign of struggle in the house except for one overturned trash can, indicating how quickly and unexpectedly the attack had occurred. The family had been completely caught off guard. As news of the massacre spread through Hamilton, the tight-knit community was devastated. Everyone knew the Ruppert family as good, decent people. Leonard Jr. was respected in his job at General Electric. Charity was known as a devoted grandmother. But even more shocking was learning that quiet, helpful James, a man neighbors had known their entire lives, was responsible for the murders. He had always seemed so harmless, so mild-mannered. How could this gentle man have committed such unspeakable violence against his own family? James was arrested and charged with 11 counts of aggravated murder. Despite his reputation as a quiet, cooperative man, James immediately became uncooperative with police. He refused to answer questions about his motive or explain why he had killed his entire family. But James did make one thing crystal clear from the very beginning. He planned to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. This announcement puzzled investigators. If James was truly insane, why had he been so methodical during the killings? Why had he changed his clothes after the murders? Why had he waited 3 hours before calling police? His actions seemed more calculated than crazy. As James's case went to trial, his defense team assembled an impressive group of psychiatrists and psychologists. They painted a picture of a man driven to madness by decades of abuse and psychological trauma. The experts testified that James suffered from paranoia and delusions stemming from his terrible childhood experiences. 2 prominent psychiatrists concluded that James had been unable to control his actions during the shooting because of his mental illness. The defense argued that years of beatings and psychological abuse had finally caused James's mind to snap on Easter Sunday. They portrayed him as a victim of his own family's cruelty, who had simply reached his breaking point. But the prosecution had a very different theory about James's motive, one that was far more disturbing than temporary insanity. District Attorney John Holcomb believed that James had committed the most calculated family murder in American history. The prosecution's investigation had uncovered evidence that James had been planning the murders for weeks or possibly months. First, James had inquired about purchasing gun silencers when buying ammunition in the weeks before the murders. When asked why he needed silencers, James claimed they were for target practice to avoid disturbing neighbors. But investigators believed he was actually planning to muffle the gunshots during the murders. Second, there was James's behavior on the day before the murders. Witnesses had seen him practicing his shooting at the Great Miami River with deadly precision. The prosecution argued this wasn't casual target practice. It was rehearsal for mass murder. Third, there was the timing of the actual murders. James had opened fire at exactly 6 p.m. on Easter Sunday, just as church bells throughout Hamilton were ringing for evening services. The loud bells had drowned out the gunshots, preventing neighbors from immediately calling for help. This suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous violence. But the prosecution's most shocking theory was about James's ultimate motive. They believed he had killed his entire family for money.
He murdered his family to collect his brother's $300,000 or so in life insurance.
The prosecution argued that James had developed an elaborate scheme to avoid the consequences of mass murder, while still collecting the financial rewards. By pleading insanity, he hoped to spend a few years in a comfortable mental hospital before being released as a wealthy man who had literally gotten away with murder. James's first trial ended with 2 out of 3 judges finding him guilty of 11 counts of aggravated murder. However, a mistrial was declared when it was discovered that the judges hadn't been properly instructed. A second trial was ordered in Findlay, Ohio. Once again, the prosecution presented their case that this was premeditated murder for financial gain, not insanity. The jury found James guilty on all 11 counts of aggravated murder. He was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences, but James wasn't finished fighting. In 1982, during an appeal hearing, his defense attorneys managed to convince a new jury to partially accept his insanity plea. The jury found James not guilty by reason of insanity on 9 of the 11 murder charges. He was found guilty of only 2 murders, those of his mother Charity and brother Leonard Jr. This partial victory meant that James was sent to a mental health facility instead of regular prison, just as the prosecution had predicted he wanted all along. At age 48, James was incarcerated at the Franklin Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio, believing he had successfully manipulated the legal system. But James had made one crucial miscalculation in his plan. Even though he had partially succeeded with his insanity defense, he never received the inheritance money he'd killed for. The families of his victims fought successfully in civil court to prevent James from profiting from his crimes. Every penny of the $300,000 fortune was distributed to other family members and charities, ensuring that James would never see a dollar of his blood money. Years passed, and James remained confined to various mental health and correctional facilities. He was granted parole hearings in 1995, 2005, and 2015, but each time his release was denied. The parole board cited his poor behavior in custody and overwhelming community opposition to his freedom. On June 4, 2022, James Urban Ruppert died of natural causes at the Franklin Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio. He was 88 years old and had spent 47 years in various forms of custody, far longer than he had ever anticipated when he planned his Easter Sunday massacre. James had gambled that he could murder 11 people, including 8 children, and still walk free with their inheritance money. Instead, he spent nearly half a century confined to institutions, never touching a penny of the fortune he had killed for, never experiencing freedom again. Like and subscribe to our channel and share with others so everyone gets awareness. Let's move on to the 6th serial killer story. Today, we'll explore 3 chilling cases that reveal how evil hides behind ordinary faces. In the first story, 3 polite knocks on a door became a death sentence for women who thought they were conducting simple business transactions. The second tale uncovers how a Baltimore father turned family bonds into weapons, dismembering his own daughter and discarding her like refuse. The third case follows a shadow who moved through the Pacific Northwest so quietly that police couldn't even prove he existed until it was too late. Please be warned, these stories contain extremely disturbing content. It started with a knock, not urgent pounding that screams danger, not the aggressive banging of someone with bad intentions, just 3 polite taps on the door. The woman inside had no idea that sound would be the last thing she'd ever hear as a free person. She thought it was a buyer responding to her classified ad. Someone interested in her furniture, her home, her belongings. It was daylight. She was safe. She was wrong. Paul Frederick Runge didn't look dangerous. Average height, thinning hair, forgettable face. The kind of man who blended into crowds and disappeared from memory. But that ordinary appearance hid something monstrous. By the time police learned his name, it was too late for at least 6 women and 1 little girl. The newspapers would eventually print his photo, but those who worked the case said the scariest thing about Paul wasn't what you could see. It was how he could sit across from you, speaking softly and gently, while hiding a killer's heart behind his mild eyes. Paul was born January 28, 1970, in Oak Forest, Illinois. On the surface, his childhood looked normal. Working-class family, small house, regular school days. But people who knew him remembered disturbing signs. He took strange pleasure in winning, even meaningless games. He was cruel to animals, brushing it off as playing around. These weren't normal childhood phases. They were warning signs that went ignored. When Paul was 17, his mother died suddenly. That loss cracked something inside him that may have been fragile to begin with. Whatever had been holding back his darker impulses, her death set them free. That same year, Paul kidnapped a 14-year-old girl. He sexually assaulted her, beat her, then did something that baffled police. He turned himself in. Psychologists would later call it a rare moment when guilt overcame compulsion. Prison was supposed to rehabilitate Paul. Instead, it educated him. He learned patience. He learned to hide. He served 7 years of a 14-year sentence and walked out in 1994. On paper, he looked like a success story. He got married, found work, smiled at neighbors. But underneath that mask, his urges hadn't died. They'd grown stronger and smarter. January 1995. Paul's wife had a friend named Stacy Frobel. Stacy was 25, bright, trusting. The kind of person who listened when you talked and believed the best in people. One evening, she came by the Runga house for what should have been a simple visit. Instead, Paul picked up a dumbbell and brought it down on her skull. The sound wasn't like the movies. It was heavier, wetter, final. Stacy fell, and the light went out of her eyes instantly. Paul carried her to the bathroom and began dismemberment. Water ran, metal scraped against bone, and something soft hit the tiles again and again. He put the pieces in trash bags and scattered them across Illinois and Wisconsin. For days, Paul called in sick to work. Then he quit entirely, as if killing had drained his need for normal life. 6 months later, he found new victims. Janetta and Nemela Pashambegovic, sisters who'd fled the war in Bosnia to start fresh in Chicago. They were 22 and 20, survivors who thought they'd escaped the worst humanity had to offer. Paul approached them with a job offer, cleaning houses. They said yes because why wouldn't they? They'd survived a war. Surely they could handle anything America threw at them. They were wrong. Inside Paul's apartment, the door locked behind them. The sisters were handcuffed, tortured for hours, then strangled. Paul dismembered their bodies and put them out with the regular trash. When sanitation workers came, the bags blended with thousands of others, carrying the sisters away like they'd never existed. Paul had perfected his method now. Classified ads. People selling homes, furniture, anything that required inviting strangers inside. In early 1997, 29-year-old Dota Jubak met Paul at her Northwest Chicago home. Whatever excuse brought him there ended in murder. He set the house on fire afterward, watching smoke curl into the winter sky like a signal only he could read. Soon after, he saw an ad from 45-year-old Yolanda Gutierrez selling her home. She answered the door with her 10-year-old daughter Jessica. Paul bound them both and spent hours torturing them before slitting their throats. Then he doused the house with accelerant and lit it up. His final known victim was Kazmira Peruch, showing her condo to potential buyers. She let Paul in expecting small talk about square footage and asking price. Instead, she was beaten, stabbed, and burned. By now, detectives were seeing the pattern. Women alone, stranger at the door, fire at the scene. But the killer remained invisible until 1997, when a routine parole check found weapons in Paul's apartment. With him in custody, investigators pressed their advantage. They had DNA from the Gutierrez murders, and it matched. When confronted with the evidence, Paul didn't fight it. "You got me," he said, then began talking. He described each murder in mechanical detail, his words flat and emotionless. The facts were too specific to be lies. The trial was a nightmare in slow motion. Jurors heard about hours of torture, saw photos of charred remains, listened to testimony that would haunt them forever. In 2006, Paul was found guilty and sentenced to death. But in 2011, Illinois abolished capital punishment. His sentence became life without parole. Today, Paul Runge sits in prison, largely forgotten by the world outside. But the communities he terrorized still remember. Paul Runge turned the most basic human interactions, buying, selling, helping strangers, into weapons of terror. He proved that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the helpful stranger at your door. The smell hit them like a punch to the gut. Baltimore sanitation workers had encountered plenty of foul odors over the years, but this was different. This was death, thick and unmistakable, rising from a shopping cart abandoned in an alley. 3 garbage bags sat inside, bulging and leaking. When they peeled back the plastic, their worst fears were confirmed. Human remains spilled out onto the pavement. Pieces of someone's daughter, mother, sister, thrown away like trash. The victim was Dominique Foster, 43 years old, and mother to 6 children. She'd been fighting addiction, trying to rebuild her life and be there for her family. But someone had decided her story was over. The shocking truth? Her killer was the one person who should have protected her own father. Lawrence Banks was born in Baltimore in 1953. Even as a child, something was wrong with him. Teachers noticed it. Neighbors whispered about it. He was quick to anger, violent without warning, and seemed to enjoy watching others suffer. Growing up in Baltimore's rough neighborhoods, Lawrence learned early that fear was power. People crossed the street to avoid him. Even his own family walked on eggshells around the boy who would become a monster. In 1975, at age 22, Lawrence showed his true colors. During a fight with his wife Vivian, he grabbed a kitchen knife and held it to her throat. He dragged her through their house, savoring her terror like a fine wine. Vivian survived, but barely. She called police, filed a report, then mysteriously dropped all charges. Fear has a way of silencing victims, and Lawrence was a master of intimidation. That same year, his violence turned on the most helpless victim of all, his baby daughter Dominique. In a rage, he threw the infant into a glass door. The impact sent shards slicing into her tiny body. She needed 22 stitches. Lawrence called it an accident. The judge called it assault with intent to disfigure. He got 15 years in prison, giving his family a brief taste of safety. But tragedy followed Lawrence even behind bars. Vivian was found dead in her apartment closet, her body so decomposed that determining cause of death was impossible. No charges were filed, but everyone knew. Lawrence's shadow reached far beyond his prison cell. Released in 1988, Lawrence had learned nothing except how to hide better. By 1991, both his children lived in terror. Dominique accused him of rape. His son described constant beatings and abuse. On November 19, 1991, Lawrence snapped completely. He shot Michael Chisholm, a former friend. Hours later, he drove to his son's foster home and killed the boy with the same gun. 2 murders, 2 20-year sentences to be served at the same time. He'd be out in just over a decade. In 2002, Lawrence Banks died, on paper. The man who walked out of prison called himself Malik Samartani. New name, same monster. In 2004, his second wife accused him of strangling her. The charges disappeared when the case fell apart. Another victim silenced, another killer set free. 2 years later, Lisa Brown and her 9-month-old daughter Labria were found shot to death. Malik was the obvious suspect, but there wasn't enough evidence. The case went cold. For years, Malik stayed quiet, but the darkness inside him never went away. By 2019, Dominique was in her 40s, still struggling with the trauma her father had caused. She was trying to be there for her own children, to break the cycle of violence. But Malik's jealousy burned as hot as ever. During a phone call, he made his feelings clear. "I don't want my daughter kissing my goddamn grandchildren. She's lucky I don't have a pistol." Days later, Dominique was gone. When police searched Malik's apartment, they found a gun hidden in a trash can. Blood evidence linked him directly to his daughter's murder. In court, the 70-year-old killer maintained his innocence. He wore sunglasses, spoke calmly about dreaming of finding the real killer. Nobody bought it. The jury convicted him of second-degree murder. The judge gave him 41 years, a life sentence for a man his age, 3 confirmed murders. But the real count may be much higher. Malik Sammartani destroyed his own family from the inside out. He didn't just kill, he poisoned every relationship, every moment of peace, every chance at happiness. His legacy is written in blood and measured in broken lives. When police finally caught Sebastian Shaw, they weren't sure what they had. Was he responsible for 3 murders, or was he one of the Pacific Northwest's most prolific serial killers? The truth was somewhere in between, buried in shadows that Shaw had spent years perfecting. Shaw erased his victims so completely that for years, police couldn't even prove he existed. He moved like smoke through the night, leaving bodies in his wake, but no traces of himself. Before he became Sebastian Shaw, before the name change and the killing spree, he was Chiang Ho, born November 28, 1967, in South Vietnam. The Vietnam War was still raging, and violence was as common as breathing. Shaw's earliest memories were of gunfire, explosions, and death. When his family fled to Oregon as refugees, they thought they were escaping the violence. They didn't know they were bringing it with them. Shaw's father was violent and controlling, continuing the cycle of abuse that had started in wartime. Shaw learned early that might made right, that the strong survived by destroying the weak. Other children noticed Shaw was different. He was detached, hard to read, emotionally absent. As a teenager, Shaw's behavior grew darker. He overdosed on aspirin in what might have been a suicide attempt, or just another reckless act. Either way, it showed a young man completely at odds with the world around him. At 17, Shaw moved to California to live with an aunt, hoping for a fresh start. He even joined the Marines, but the structure and discipline couldn't contain whatever was broken inside him. He was discharged for failing weight standards, though behavioral issues were likely the real reason. Back in Oregon, Shaw legally changed his name to Sebastian Alexander Shaw. New name, same problems. He found work as a security dispatcher for a cable company. But in June 1991, multiple women accused him of sexual harassment. He was fired immediately. July 1st, 1991. Jay Rick, a 39-year-old quadriplegic, was lying in bed in his Portland apartment. Jay lived alone but relied on friends and caregivers who came and went throughout the day. He was warm and trusting, qualities that made him an easy target. Someone entered Jay's apartment that night without forcing the door. There was no struggle, no noise, no sign of disturbance. Just quiet footsteps in the dark and the sound of controlled breathing. The killer approached Jay's bed and drew a blade across his throat in one smooth motion. The cut was deep enough to kill instantly. When police arrived the next day, they found a scene of surgical precision. Jay's sheets were soaked with blood, but there were no fingerprints, no defensive wounds, no signs of robbery. The killer had come and gone like a shadow. The case went cold immediately. 1 year later, the shadow returned. July 20th, 1992. 18-year-old Donna Ferguson and her 26-year-old boyfriend Todd Rudiger were spending a quiet night at home in their trailer. The killer likely entered while they slept. Todd was attacked first. A blade slashed across his throat with enough force to sever major blood vessels. He died without ever waking up. Donna was bound, sexually assaulted, then killed the same way. One decisive cut to the neck, delivered by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Police found no forced entry, no obvious struggle beyond the victims themselves. Once again, the killer had been careful and methodical. For 2 years, nothing connected these murders except in the mind of the man who committed them. In August 1994, Shaw made his first mistake. A patrol officer in Redding, California, noticed a parked car with fogged windows and stolen license plates. Inside, Shaw was sleeping peacefully. When they searched his trunk, officers found a collection that made their blood run cold. Ski mask, rope, handcuffs, duct tape, gloves, and knives. This wasn't camping equipment. This was a kit designed for abduction and murder. But there was no active crime to connect it to. No missing person that matched the timeline. Shaw served a short sentence for the stolen car and walked free. Back in Portland, detectives working the Rick and Ferguson Rudiger cases took notice. Shaw's background fit, his tools fit, his capability fit, but they had no proof. By 1997, DNA testing had advanced enough to be useful. Police still had biological evidence from Donna Ferguson's assault. They just needed Shaw's DNA to compare it to. They began surveillance, waiting for Shaw to discard something they could test. The breakthrough came outside a Safeway store when Shaw lit a cigarette, smoked it down, and tossed the butt on the ground. Detectives swooped in before anyone else could contaminate the evidence. The lab results were conclusive. Shaw's DNA matched samples from Donna Ferguson's body. On February 20th, 1998, police surrounded Shaw. He didn't resist or panic. Even in handcuffs, he seemed calm, like this was just another event in an ordinary day. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the threat of death penalty, Shaw pleaded guilty to murdering Donna Ferguson and Todd Rudiger. He received 2 life sentences without parole. In prison, Shaw mostly kept to himself. But one day, he told a fellow inmate something that made even hardened criminals uncomfortable. He claimed to have killed 10, maybe 12 people total. When police heard about this, they pressed Shaw for details. He didn't deny the claim, but offered a deal. Move him to a federal prison where he could smoke and guarantee no new charges would carry the death penalty. Police refused. Shaw went silent and never spoke about additional victims again. Shaw spent over 2 decades in Oregon State Penitentiary. He never showed remorse, never confessed to more than what was proven in court. On October 4th, 2021, guards found Shaw dead in his cell. He was 53 years old. The cause of death was never released. Officially, Sebastian Shaw killed 3 people. Unofficially, the number could be much higher. Only Shaw knew the truth, and he took those secrets to his grave. Shaw represents the most dangerous type of killer, one who perfected the art of invisibility. He moved through the world like smoke, striking without warning and disappearing without trace. His victims never saw him coming, and investigators could barely prove he'd been there at all.